Yeah, sure. God in heaven, we thank you for the blessed Sabbath and the fact that we've come through this week healthy and strong. We thank you for the fellowship we can have and to learn more about who you are, that our minds may be corrected of things that we have incorrect, and that we may understand who you are, that we may represent you in an accurate way to those around us, that we may bring them to the knowledge of the midnight cry and into your kingdom. We ask that you be with us as we go over these studies and impress upon our minds the things that we are to understand. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Okay. Share. All right. Wait a minute here. Okay, I'm going to minimize this so I can see. Right. Mouse. Click that thing off. Wonder why not. Oh. Well, we could keep that there. I just, yeah, the video, I could click mine off. Here, now I can't see it.
What are you trying?
Yeah, I was trying to minimize the video or the pictures of both Elaine and I. Got the,
They're not showing up.
they're showing up in the corner on the right.
Okay. If there's like a little hyphen, you know, like a.
Yeah, it says thumbnail video hide, and I'm clicking on it, but it's not going away. I don't know why. I'm using my mouse too. Huh. I don't know. There it goes. There it goes. All right. So I'm glad to be with you tonight and that we're together, whoever joins us in later. This is the Civil War in America's Churches. It's part 1 by Elder Tess. And this was presented by Tony at one time. The Midnight Watch, of course, we have our date that she gave this, which is June 20th, 2020. I don't know what camp meeting this was, though. Does anybody else know? It says camp meeting, but not sure. So I went through this more than 2 times. And today, I really concentrated on it today. And I took notes on it, in fact. And so I hope we can have some participation, whatever thoughts that you have out there. It's past history, which is absolutely, it really on the lines. It gives us history from the Alpha, the Omega, from the Millerites, their line, pre-Adventism, and Civil War time, and it gives us a lot of history. And I don't remember this study, but you know, it really is, it just seemed to click. Everything that I was reading was clicking like, this is just what I needed. So I'm thankful to be able to share it tonight. So we'll go ahead and start reading, and if anyone has any questions or thoughts, then just let me know. So, all right, so my attention today is to go back over the history that we've been over for the last month. And each time we go over this history, it becomes a little more detailed. I have tried to make the argument in the past that when we look at these dispensations, beginning and end of ancient Israel, beginning and end of modern Israel, that God is opening them up in specific order. I thought that was very important. I'm thankful too for the highlighting. Tony probably did this, and really the whole thing could be highlighted, but yeah, she put some really specific things that were good to look at. Can everyone see this pretty clearly with the size of the, yeah, just being able to look at it. It's not real too small or anything.
I'm okay. I don't know about everybody else.
Everyone else okay?
Yeah, it seems good to me.
All right, good. Okay, so down here. Up more. I think I'm gonna just use my. Now I'm gonna figure out where am I? This is, I'm figuring this out. I could just click it. Okay, I know there's the arrows, right?
Right, and that goes down page by page. But
You have to go up though, because
yeah, because we're not going to see the whole page, so you'll need to use the scroll bar on the right hand side.
okay. Right here.
Or you can press the arrow, the down arrow down at the bottom, whatever is easier.
At the bottom.
So
Okay.
yeah, where you have the scroll bar right there, if you move your cursor all the way down to the bottom, there's an arrow. So that will go down a little at a time, a little bit to the left, a little right there. So if you click on that, that'll scroll you down a little at a time.
Okay, well, I need to go up.
Okay.
Okay.
You can
Where
do
am I?
the same thing with that scroll arrow at the top.
Okay, so I was there. Sorry. Oh, well. Okay, we understood our. Oh, getting frustrated a little bit. Okay. Okay, I think that's where I was, sorry. Dispensations, beginning and end of ancient Israel and beginning and end of modern Israel. That God is opening them up in specific order. All right, we understood our history, particularly the events relating to the close of probation. For the first group called the nature of that close of probation. The shaking that occurred before, we have understood a lot based on the understanding of end of ancient Israel. So while we have these particularly 4 key histories, Alpha, Omega, ancient of ancient, Alpha and Omega of modern, each one of those histories is properly opening in an order, which we know how God works. So we have on this line, we're going to look at at pagan nations. And we also have the Alpha, which we have, first of all, let's go from the beginning. Ancient, I wasn't sure what this meant, dark cat. Does anybody have any thoughts about dark cat, what that means?
The first part probably means darkness. And the second is
Dark.
captivity. So darkness and captivity.
Oh, okay, that's it. All righty, thank you. So we have Alpha, the Alpha history, 400 years. Egypt, and we have the Sabbath. Then we have Babylon. Then we have the 490 in the Omega, success, which is Rome. And then wrong is king, kingdom, X events, and parables. So going back to this, darkness and captivity in ancient. So we have the last Sabbath.
I think it's lost the
that?
Sabbath.
What was that?
I think it's lost. They lost the Sabbath. I think.
Oh, okay. I was wondering, what is that? Last Sabbath,
Yeah.
lost Sabbath. Yes.
They lost the Sabbath.
They lost the Sabbath. And then we have the arrow down here to modern, but we'll just finish this out. Protestant, because we're going to see this line in the next 4 pages. So we need to get familiar with this. Sabbath, under Sabbath, we have Protestant churches going down further. We'll get into that. And then we went through this. This is John. We know who John is. And so the 1260 would be the next point. That is Protestant. And then we have the 126 parables. Parables here under parables, SDA. And then we have modern under 1260, 1798. Then we have the churches. Then we have 1989, our time, Omega, and literal to spiritual. So, are there any questions on that or thoughts? Because it's going to refer to it, like I said, quite a few times. So we have modern. It's the Millerite time, 1798. That is, and then the Sabbath. Then we have 1888. Then we have 144,000. And that is on that line. It appears off of here, but it's the SDA right here, Seventh-day Adventists. So next page. Okay, so we have literal to literal from Protestants divided. We have liberal and conservative. It's literal to literal and Christian nation, church and state, conservative, conspiracy theories, deep state, satanic, Hamilton and Jefferson. So it's laying it out, the 2 divisions there, the liberal side and the conservative side. 2 streams of information that will be covered. So we have the Christian nation, which was slavery, Sunday law, and SEG is, what's that stand for? Anyone?
Segregation.
Women.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
segregation.
think it's segregation.
Segregation. Okay, thank you. Segregation, and then we have feminism and LGBT. So with the theories, conspiracy theories equals ignorance. The Ramsey theory, which we just heard a study on that. I don't know that, did Luke give that? I'm not sure, but I know it was mentioned and we did study that a while back. So the two methodologies, this is all about the conspiracy theory deal, all the wrong thinking and being on the wrong side. Two methodologies. So we'll put down a little bit more here. Why is it? Why is it? It's giving an example of what this looks like. So with Diana, it was like 1.5 hours, 1.5 hours, 3 miles. Oh, could it be? Was she murdered? So we jumped to that conclusion.
That was Princess
Then we have,
Diana.
pardon me?
Princess Diana?
Yes, Princess
Yes, that was-
Diana.
Okay. Mhm.
Okay, good. Climate change. Oh, ice expansion. No climate change. No climate. Deep state con. That's coming from the deep state. Could it be? Okay, here we go with Clinton. And this was Hillary Clinton shaking, her shaking. Oh, could it be that she's having a stroke or seizures? Then jumping to these conclusions. Okay,
Jackie?
next one. Yeah, I could,
Yeah,
Go
just
ahead.
it is quite a fast brain way of analyzing things, isn't it? Like that, why
Yeah.
is it and could it be? Opposed to the slow brain.
yes. Do you have anything to say on the other side?
Well, I guess we use parable methodology, which is slower, isn't it? I guess.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. This would be the fast brain.
Yeah.
We could use that term. Yeah, with Obama, Hussein, oh yeah, he's a Muslim. Obama, a Muslim, he's a Shia. Oh dear, he doesn't qualify to run for president here in America, in the USA. I remember this whole thing going on because I was into this quite a bit. So next point, next one they're saying here, why is it? Oh, Iran nuclear deal. Number one, Syria. Okay, could it be Rothschild, Red Shield? I'm not sure what that red shield stands for, but that's a red flag or something to be looking at, looking for.
That's what their name meant, Red Shield. Rothschild means Red Shield, I think.
They put that label Red Shield on other things too. But, you know, the Rothschilds are to be identified because it's like, I had thought it was like, it puts up a red flag, you know. There's a lot of stuff going on here that is all run by the Rothschilds. And so we know that's happening because they want to control the world. So anyway, that was my kind of thought on it. Anyone else has any thoughts? Speak out. We know those reform lines were given to us as a movement in 1989, but they have not been properly laid out and explained. Many of them is not yet done for the Alpha history of ancient Israel, and it is not yet done for our own Alpha history, the beginning of modern Israel. Okay.
I'm looking
So
at,
we spent, go ahead.
looking at the Ninja Sheep presentation, and
Yeah,
Elder Tess said that Rothschilds, that name means Red Shield.
oh, it does mean Red Shield. I wonder if it's applied to other things though too. even though that read, other conspiracy theories.
Mhm.
I don't know. It's
I think
Yeah.
was
No, I was
was she?
just-
Sorry.
I was just looking it up and it's just a symbol of a shield with a sword and stuff for Red Shield.
okay.
That's what the Google says. So Luke may have something else.
Luke was going to say something.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think Elder Tess was just mentioning about the red shields. I think Walter Vyth had brought that up, if I'm not mistaken. But then if you look at Walter Vyth's name, I recall they're saying something about this is what Walter Vyth says, Rothschild's red shield. But then if you actually look at the name of Walter Vyth, that's something to do with the papacy, I think. So his own methodology was, going to get himself unstuck if he applied that to his own name. I think
Yeah.
that's what she was saying in the study. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Anybody else? Okay, we'll move on. So we've spent a lot of time covering the end of ancient Israel, the history of John the Baptist and Christ in the early church, the history of Christ's first advent to explain our history now, and the experiences that we have been through. But what now needs to be opened? The next step is to understand more properly our Alpha history, the beginning of modern Israel. So we went through this a page or so back. So this time of Millerite's history, both what happened inside the movement and what happened outside the movement are extremely important for us to understand. It is part of the opening light for this dispensation. So each time we go over this history, it is with an agenda. And I just want to do that again. Except this time, we are going to add in more details than what we have previously looked at. So for about a month, we have been comparing ancient and modern. As we revise, I particularly want to look at 1844 history and 1888, but also what is happening externally in the United States. So we compared and contrasted ancient and modern. We saw ancient, it comes out of pagan nations. Modern, it comes out of Protestant churches. You can compare the two. You also need to contrast. The rules of parable teaching, you compare and you contrast. And when you contrast, you see that while we came out of Protestant churches, that it looked different to the coming out of Egypt, because there has been this separation between church and state. And that's the importance of this comparing and contrasting. As we know, this is what leads us to the truth of what's really going on in our dispensation, other dispensations, other than the original coming out of pagan nations. They took it literally, which, well, it says modern, it comes out of Protestants. So go too far with that because it will be answered. And when you contrast, you see that while we came out of Protestant churches, that it looked different to the coming out of Egypt, because there has been a separation between church and state. Yes, that's the difference. So we see this again on our line. So we did not come out of a nation, we came out of a church. Coming back to the ancient history of ancient Israel, they came out of pagan nations, but we observed how they held on to the idolatry of Egypt, of those pagan nations, even until the end of the 490 years, and where they were finally cut off. I want to reinforce that point. If you go to the Old Testament scriptures and you see what was said to Israel in the history of Solomon, I am going to paraphrase a couple of quick quotes quickly of what God said to Solomon. He said, "But if you turn away and forsake my statutes and my commandments, which I've set before you, and shall go and serve other gods and worship them, then will I pluck them up by the roots out of my land, which I've given them. And this house, which I've sanctified for my name, will I cast out of my sight, and I will make it to be a proverb and a byword among all nations. And this house, which is high, shall be an astonishment to everyone that passeth by it, so that he shall say, why hath the Lord done this unto this land and unto this house? And it shall be answered." Lost my place. "And it shall be answered, because they forsook the Lord God of their fathers, which brought them out of the land of Egypt, and laid hold on other gods, and worshiped them, and served them. Therefore hath he brought all this evil upon them."
What's a proverb and a byword?
A byword.
Because if you back up just a teeny bit,
Yeah, to be a proverb and a byword among all nations, like, well, I don't have the actual interpretation of that from Wikipedia, but a proverb, like,
isn't it
you
a
won't
parable?
forget it? Is it a
Isn't it a
proverb? Is it
parable
a
or
parable?
a parable or a prophecy? Anybody? But I didn't know byword.
Yeah, I
Can
didn't
you
either.
back up just a little bit?
Sure. See that?
Yeah. So the house. Okay. So this house, which
The
I've
house.
sanctified, he's going to cast his
Mhm.
house out,
Right.
and that's going to be
Cast
a
out of my
proverb or
sight.
byword.
I'll make it to be a proverb and a byword among all nations.
A person or thing cited as a notorious and outstanding example or embodiment of something. That's byword, Christine. Thank you.
Yeah, that's good. In other words, how could we say that? As like, it's not forgotten? Would that fit? I don't know. It's something that comes to pass, though. God's people.
Yeah, but it's going to be a parable, if I'm understanding correctly. Anybody else? What he's done.
Yeah. Yeah. In our understanding now, it would be a parable.
If I have that correct. So that must be.
Anyone else? Anybody else have any thoughts on that? Not. So it might be answered even more down here too. So we can see that fulfilled in the captivity to Babylon and the destruction of Jerusalem. So it was fulfilled in that time. But it is fulfilled again in 70 AD. And why is Israel again in 70 AD destroyed and in captivity? It is because they were on the wrong side of the blessings and the cursing. So in other words, they were cursed if they're on the wrong side. It is because they were on the wrong side of the blessings and cursing. That only happened when Israel laid hold of other gods and worshiped them. The problem is that it is difficult to see in the time period of John the Baptist and Christ that they're doing that because they look like good people. And because you do not see this golden calf sitting in Jerusalem. So it is hard to identify that they are in this idolatry.
We did a study not too long ago, or a presentation not too long ago about the golden calf was equal
Yes.
to the what would you call them?
David's bull.
Yeah, it was the Apis bull. But
David's bull.
he was equal to the emperor.
Mhm.
They were the same. They had the same characteristics and everything. They were equal. Just throwing that in
Yeah.
there.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, in fact, you did the study on the Apis bull just recently, Tony.
Hey, I have a
Okay.
question, Becky.
Sure, go ahead.
The text you have up there in blue, where's that taken from? I missed that part.
Oh, up above here.
Yeah, where you have the word by word in there and all that.
Yeah. Okay, this text is from
It doesn't say, but I'm thinking it might be prophet.
Isaiah. Huh? Did she give a text? The commandments I have set before you. I
Yeah.
don't see the,
Yeah,
I don't see the
a
quote.
reference on it.
Yeah, it's the commandments. But if you turn away and forsake my statutes and my commandments, and that's I don't know. I'm not going to guess at it, but
Okay.
yeah,
Thank you.
you're welcome. Okay. All right, so we see the golden calf was not recognized in modern Israel or the Omega time. It was disguised more with the Jews in the time of Christ. Okay, so Ellen White speaking about the Jewish nation in the Signs of the Times, that's May 23rd, 1900, paragraph 5, is considering the children of Israel not for others, but for themselves, did they minister. God created them to live in a world where unselfish service must be performed. But in the place of doing this, they grasped everything for themselves. The eye is so large that they cannot see anything else. They are not in touch with suffering humanity. Christ came to show them the way of life, but they were determined to walk in their own selfish way, and the Lord gave them up as joined to their idols. So they have this problem with their idols and idolatry. And because you do not see a golden calf in this history, it's hard for us to imagine that the issues that they faced was the issue of idolatry. You can go back to Leviticus 26, there it is. Is that part of it? The quote from Leviticus 26. You shall make no idols, nor graven image, neither rear you up a standing image, neither shall ye set up any image of stone in your land to bow down unto it. For I am the Lord your God. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. If you walk in my statutes, and then starts the blessings. So there is two paths before the nation of Israel, before the people of God. You either keep the Sabbath, reverence the sanctuary, do not set up any idols or graven images or images of stone, no idol worship. If you do that, you are blessed. If you do not keep the Sabbath, if you do not reverence the sanctuary, if you practice idolatry, then will be the cursings. You will lose your king. You will be trodden down by a pagan nation. God will pass you by when at the end of the 490 years, choose that second course. It is because they have done these things. It appears they are keeping the Sabbath. It appears they have put away idolatry, that they are reverencing the sanctuary, but they are not. You cannot see this by literal to literal interpretation. It is not literal. It is not literal golden calf or literal golden calf idolatry here. It's time. Omega. But the same idolatry that led to the creation of the Apis bull is still there, not in the image, but in the mindset, in the worldview of the people of Israel. This is running so deep that when you have, as we lay out their history with its fractals, the first group called, they come up to the cross, which we line up with 2019. This is the first group. It is the disciples that were trained to go back to the church and then warn the world. First disciples, then we see the cross, 2019. That this waymark of the cross, soon after the waymark of the cross, when Christ is resurrected and he comes back to the disciples approached him and say, now are you going to set up your kingdom? Now are you going to overthrow the Romans? They are. After the harvest, the new kingdom. They weren't ready. So even in the history of their harvest, even in the history after their close of probation, the disciples are still misunderstanding the kingdom, and the external events. The idolatry runs so deep, it is that hard to remove. So remember this, we saw it in the beginning, this line, Alpha and Omega. And yet we still find them in this mess down in this history. And it is not until they go through the harvest that they find that Christ must reteach them what he had already taught them. That has a lot of implications for where we are today. Any thoughts? Questions? The messages of our last dispensation are being retaught because they have not been properly understood, or they have, at the very least, are still failing to be implemented in large parts of this movement. How necessary this study is. So you have idolatry as they come out of Egypt, and then in the history of captivity to Rome, they are still in idolatry. They have kept hold of the Apis bull. So now that says a lot about Adventism for future. It does not look like what you would expect idolatry to look. Adventists do not need to start keeping the Sabbath. The Jews did not start keeping the Sunday worship and start reverencing a pagan god or the sun god. They did not have to bow down the sun god to still take in that idolatry. It showed itself in how they perceived God's kingdom on earth. So coming back to this history of the beginning of modern Israel, let's expand on this view a little and go back in time to where America was founded as colonies. So now we're looking at the Protestant time. Modern, here we go, 1798, we have the Millerites. We have the churches, the Sabbath. Then we have 1888. We have 126 and 1989. Parables here, literal to spiritual, 1989. And we have 144,000 in the SDA. If we can call this the Millerites' history, it began in 1798 and it was to go for 65 years until 1863, when we would have expected, based on the 2520, the second advent, if they had been faithful. 1798, Millerite, 1863. So that is the extent of the Millerite history. And in this history, you have 1850, which we identify as the history of the Sunday law for that dispensation. We stuck with that term of Sunday law because how it has been integrated into Adventism through the Great Controversy. But you must think, if Christ was meant to come back in 1863, with the very least, know that Ellen White is saying by early 1870 that Christ should have returned. If Christ is meant to have returned by that period, what must have happened to America in that 65 years? In 1798, the United States rises as a lamb-like beast. And it has how many horns? How many horns does it have? There it tells us. It has 2 horns. It has the horn of Protestantism and the horn of Republicanism. So by 1863, what had to happen to the horns of that lamb-like beast? They had to be broken. Just the Protestant horn? No, both horns must be broken before the second advent. So going back into that history, as we investigated, we should expect to see both horns broken. Now we know the history was a history of failure. We know that it did not all wrap up, you could say, the way that God had intended it to, if his people were faithful. But if that history had not been complete and had not been faithful, and he had not returned, you would have expected to see a broken Protestant horn, which we already are familiar with, that history. You also need to see a broken Republican horn before 1863, and both need to be identifiable in our Alpha history. So let us go back to the year 1619. I learned some things here with the next few pages. This is a year before the Mayflower Pilgrims arrived in the United States. So it is exceedingly early in their history as a colony. So I want to take us back to 1619 and what happened this year. It was a major subject last year, being the 400-year anniversary. 400-year anniversary. Two momentous events happened in Britain's fledgling colony in Virginia. The New World's first democratic assembly convened, and an English privateer brought kidnapped Africans to sell as slaves. Such were the conflicted origins of modern America. I never heard this at school. In the newly built church at Jamestown, Virginia, the General Assembly, the first gathering of a representative governing body in America, came together. A few weeks later, a battered privateer entered the Chesapeake Bay carrying the first African slaves to land on mainland English America. Battered privateer, that was the ship, I guess. Huh? So within a few weeks, those two momentous events, and we'll keep this in mind, those two events as we go on, events that define the founding of America. The first democratic beginning of government. Second, the introduction of British slavery to America. Those two, keep them in mind. So in 1619, you have these two issues happening within a few weeks of time. I want us to think about the first representative government that formed in 1619. So for now, we are going to put the slavery subject to one side. Not going to forget it, but we're going to put it to one side. One of the difficulties with this history is we are weaving different threads together at the same time. So when we mark these two events, putting slavery to one side, I want us to think about this representative government. Following instructions from the Virginia Company of London, the colony's financial backers, the meeting's principal purpose was to introduce just laws for the happy guiding and governing of the people. The assembly sat as a single body and was made up of the governor, Sir George Ridley, his 4 councillors and 22 burgesses, chosen by the free white male inhabitants of every town, corporation, and large plantations throughout the colony. The representatives who gathered for the initial meeting of the first representative assembly in the New World dealt extensively with the subject of religion. The very first order of business for this group of leading Virginians was a prayer. Later in this session, legislation was passed relating to religious expression that made clear the extensive ties between church and state. In the early years of settlement, according to historian Harry Miller, the assembly enacted a series of religious laws that are a match for anything to be found in Puritan societies. I want to quote one of the laws enacted at the 1619 beginning of democratic government. One of the laws is written, all persons whatsoever upon Sabbath days shall frequent divine service and sermons. Both before noon and afternoon, and all such as bear arms shall bring their pieces, swords, powder, and shot. And everyone that shall transgress this law shall forfeit 3 shillings a time to the use of the church, all lawful and necessary impediments accepted. So, if a river floods and you cannot cross it, and you cannot get to church, that is an exception. But if a servant in this case shall willfully neglect his master's command to attend church, he shall suffer bodily punishment. So at this very beginning of democratic government in the United States, there is a clear union between church and state, and a law of that union that particularly interests us is the law enforcing Sunday observance. And the punishment by fine for all who do not attend church, punishment with bodily inaction for any servants, any heresy could lead to the most severe sentence. Banishment, being forced to leave the colony, a banished individual, banished for heresy, caught returning to the settlement could be put to death. Another major crime was blasphemy. They could be sentenced to whipping, to the pillory, which is essentially as the type of stocks, have a hole made in their tongue with a red hot iron, or stand for a period of time on the gallows with a rope around their neck. Other laws punish colonists for not properly observing the Sabbath, Sunday, observed as a day of rest and worship, skipping religious services. Some colonial laws even banned traveling on Sunday. Various forms of these Sunday laws existed in all colonies. So right back at the very beginning, the United States has 2 problems. From the very forming of this representative government, they have Sunday law and slavery. 1619, 1863. We talk about the 1850, a Fugitive Slave Act. That Fugitive Slave Act was already put in place in 1793. 1793, the first Fugitive Slave Act, slave law, was enacted by Congress, requiring all states, including those states that forbid slavery, to forcibly return slaves who have escaped from other states to their original owners. Let's back up here on this line. 1793 to 1850. Slave Act. The law stated that no person held the service of labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such labor or service, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. So this was all in place in 1793, but it was not enforced. So you already have slavery, not just slavery itself, but prior to 1798, the Fugitive Slave Act. You already have Sunday laws in every colony in the United States. This church-state union began to change in the history of the American Revolution. It was part of this wave of freedom. In 1776, none of the American state governments observed the separation of church and state. On the contrary, all 13 states either had established state churches or required their office holders to profess a certain faith. So every single one of the 13 states that existed by 1776 required office holders to profess a certain Protestant faith, and they had enforced state churches. Are there any questions? Thoughts? So a state would say, our state church is the Methodist Church or the Presbyterian Church. Over the 6 decades after 1776, however, that changed. Massachusetts stopped supporting an official religious denomination in 1833. It was the final state to do so. Is 1833 a waymark for this movement? Yes. In 1833, the final of those 13 states stopped supporting an official religious denomination. Historians call that gradual process. Disestablishment. You can't start to see why Ellen White, you can start to see why Ellen White said that in 1798, the United States was just rising to power. When we think about Acts 20, verse 7, what we are doing is we are paralleling two institutions. We are paralleling the United States as an institution and Seventh-day Adventism as an institution. And we do that through Acts 27. And what we see is that they both rise in 1798. This is the rising of the United States as an institution and the rising of the Seventh-day Adventism. We parallel them through Acts 27. When Seventh-day Adventism is raised up as a movement in 1798, what problem do we have? We have many problems. We are a mess. We are keeping Sunday. We do not understand prophecy. William Miller is still a teenager. He is yet to become a deist, let alone start studying.
Just to clarify,
Yeah,
it's Acts 27, like chapter 27. Just to clarify.
oh, yeah, I know. It's Acts 27.
Yeah, chapter
You said.
27. Where you parallel the United States, the Midnight Cry message, where you parallel the United States. Just
Yeah, because it says it
Just
right
for the
there, Acts 20, verse 7, right?
it's chapter 27.
Oh, is that a mistake then?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify it for the record.
Oh, okay, I gotcha.
So it's chapter 27.
Yeah. Yeah, where it was written out, chapter 20,
Yeah.
verse 7. Thank you for that.
Just wanted to clarify it for the recording.
Yeah, thank you. Adventism has all these problems in 1798. So we do not know who we are about to become when we think of us as a separate institution. The United States is much the same. Both institutions began in 1798 with all these problems. Neither of them is okay. Neither of them has their identity figured out. We're going to go through an increase of knowledge by which we're going to learn about the second advent. We're going to learn about the Sabbath. We're going to learn about the 2300 days, the 1260, the nature of man, all those different subjects. Adventism begins here. You got that? Adventism begins here. And then we have this progressive increase of knowledge. The same happens for the United States, even though it had begun as colonies decades before, and then through a revolution becomes free prior to 1798, it still comes into the history of 1798 with all this baggage. In brief, Seventh-day Adventism raised up in 1798 as baggage. It must learn and unlearn. The United States in 1798 as baggage. It must learn and unlearn. Repeated. United States and Seventh-day Adventism. What it must unlearn is the union of church and state. What we must learn is to separate the two. It also must unlearn the legacy practice of slavery. While we go through an increase of knowledge, learning and unlearning, so where they go through a same increase of knowledge, which is why in 1833 you see this last state disestablished. The term they use for disestablishment, the removing of religion, religious organizations from state establishments. A large part of this work was done by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who have been covering in detail. Many political leaders, including Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, favored disestablishment because they saw the relationship between church and state as a tool of oppression. Jefferson proposed a statute for religious freedom. So, am I in the right spot? Somebody check me. Okay, I'm sorry. A large part of this work was done by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who we have been covering in detail. Many political leaders, including Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, favored disestablishment. We read this because they saw the relationship between church and state as a tool of oppression. Jefferson proposed a statute for religious freedom in Virginia State Assembly in 1779. So Jefferson has already in 1779 proposed in Virginia this separation of church and state. but his bill failed in the overwhelming Anglican legislature. The Anglican Church had so much power within the state of government of Virginia that his attempt to remove this Protestant denomination as the state recognized religion failed. Okay. I'm going to read that again. The Anglican Church had so much power within the state government of Virginia that his attempt to remove this Protestant denomination as the state recognized religion failed. Oh, I got it. Hope I didn't confuse anybody there. Madison proposed it again in 1785, and it defeated a rival bill that would have given equal revenue to all Protestant churches. Instead, they decided that Virginia would not use public money to support religion. Jefferson wrote, "The religion then of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man, and it is the right of every man to exercise it as these may dictate." Quoting A.T. Jones, September 13th, 1894, that was AMS. What's that stand for? That, you know, Elaine? AMS from A.T. Jones? 282.3.
American something Sentinel, maybe.
Yeah,
something.
American Sentinel.
Yeah,
Okay,
maybe. I can look it up to be sure, but I think so.
all right. A.T. Jones wrote, "The framers of the Constitution understood that separation of church and state and liberty of conscience was the result of the Reformation." So someone recently asked a question: how do we recognize as a movement that the founders of the Constitution, those early founders, that they separated church and state because of what they witnessed in the 1260, what the Protestant denominations had suffered under the persecution of the church-state union? This is a good quote to answer that question. A.T. Jones's quote. It's saying that the framers of the Constitution understood the separation and that liberty of conscience was the result of the Reformation. Madison and Jefferson, the champions of separation. Church and state and constitutional convention, which framed the Constitution, said, and he goes on to quote them. Is there any questions up to this point? We all good? I want to note first, A.T. Jones is making the point that they separated church and state because they recognized what had happened in the 1260. So the other point that I wanted us to consider was that he describes Madison and Jefferson as champions of a separation of church and state. And this becomes important when we think about the way they are handled by the Christian right today. If you go back into history, that holds true. He is going to quote Jefferson from what he presented at Virginia Assembly. He says, "In a struggle which resulted in disestablishing the church in that colony, and from which struggle they came to the National Convention." So it really began in Virginia. There's 9 people that have, looks like, on the chat. If there's any questions there in the chat, somebody want to look that up? Okay, so in a struggle which resulted in disestablishing the church in that colony, and from which struggle they came to the National Convention. So it really began in Virginia. It was the work of Madison and Jefferson in Virginia to separate church and state. that they later took to the National Convention and got written into the Bill of Rights later. Jefferson says we would also humbly represent the only proper objects of civil government are the happiness and protection of men in the present status of existence. Cutting part of his letter out to illustrate and confirm these assertions, we beg leave to observe that to judge for ourselves and to engage in the exercise of religion agreeably to the dictates of our own consciences is an inalienable right, which upon the principles on which the gospel was first propagated and the Reformation from popery carried on, can never be transferred to another. So in Madison and Jefferson's own words, they are recognizing that it is an inalienable right to choose our own religious beliefs and practices. And they recognize that this was a cause behind the Reformation, and that they can give an example of why this is necessary. The separation of church and state, because what happened in the 1260 under popery. This action in Virginia by Thomas Jefferson and Madison was the forerunner to the First Amendment protections for religious freedom. Before he died, Thomas Jefferson left instructions of 3 things that he wanted inscribed on his grave's epitaph. He wished to be remembered for 3 things, one of them being the Virginia's Statute of Religious Freedom. It was not even about the First Amendment. He wanted to be remembered for what he did in Virginia. One of the 3 things he wished to have inscribed. After he was elected president in 1800, in 1801, the Danbury Baptist Association sent him a letter expressing their concern that in their state of Connecticut, their state constitution did not explicitly protect religious liberty. In replying early, January 1st, 1802, Thomas Jefferson says the following: believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between men and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legislative powers of government reach actions only and not opinions. I contemplate with a sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature would make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. It is from this letter in 1802 to the Danbury Baptist Association that we were given the phrase wall of separation between church and state. He gave us those visuals. God. So when you think about Thomas Jefferson, along with Madison, he particularly was the person who brought forward the First Amendment and promoted the separation of church and state in America, which is why the fundamentalist Protestant conservatives of that era did not want him president. He is also the only president in US history, I did not know this either, who has not from the office of president proclaimed the day of Thanksgiving. You see all of them. You see Obama pardoning the turkey. There are all these practices around Thanksgiving. Thomas Jefferson is the only US president to never make the proclamation of Thanksgiving as a holiday while he was in office. And the reason he didn't do that is, as he wrote, for him to stand in office and proclaim Thanksgiving, it was a day of not fasting and prayer as the other days that other administrations would offer, but it was still recognized as a religious holiday. And in the respect as a religious holiday, in that respect, he would not even sanction Thanksgiving while in office. No other US president has ever taken that position on Thanksgiving while in office. While in office, no other US president has ever taken that position on Thanksgiving. So straight down the line was he on this issue. So you don't see the United States rise up as a lamb-like beast in 1619. There was nothing lamb-like about the colonies in their attitude towards slavery or in their attitudes towards church and state and Sunday laws. Both of those things, however badly they practiced them, remember, they were to have an increase of knowledge. If this would have gone correctly for both, for the United States as it was to go correctly for the Seventh-day Adventists, they would have not just separated church and state fully, they also would have had abolished slavery. Okay. Sorry. Let's see, that would have become the nation that they were designed to be. But like Adventism, that plan was derailed. We recognize that in Acts 27, when it shows that ship going off course, already framed in the United States is this statement that all men are created equal. Black, white, it does not matter. All men are created equal. Already enshrined is the separation of church and state. They were already there. All the United States had to do was have an increase of knowledge, put into practice what they learned, just as in Adventism. So what we want to look at next is continuing this triple application of prophecy, but with some further details. We understand the triple application: World War I plus World War II equals World War III. First woe plus second woe equals third woe. When we come to the subject of church and state in America, the Republican horn, we can see 1 + 2 = 3. First, this history, the 1850 subject of slavery. Second, the 1888 message, or 1888 history, the enforcement of Sunday laws. The first plus the second will teach us what Sunday law looks like in our own time. You could say this in a different way. You could say early writings plus the Great Controversy equals now. So we see early writing at the top. Great Controversy, 1888. Sunday law, last one, 1789. Sunday law equals 3. 2, Great Controversy 2 equals 3 on the bottom line. Early writings covering the first history, the sins of Babylon. Great Controversy covering the second history, Sunday laws in the United States. Both teaching us of our own history and the final dispensation, the end of modern Israel. And you can see that these two issues that America has, church and state and slavery, were all introduced in 1619 at the very beginning. They had a fully functioning Sunday law, and they had a fully functioning system of slavery. And prior to 1798, also the Slave Act. All that they did in this history, 1850, all that they do is they take that Slave Act that existed before, and they say, now we are going to enforce what was already there. So all that they are doing in 1888 is saying we finally need to enforce what was already there because it was already in place. What had happened in the early 1800s was that those laws were not being enforced, but they were on the books. Coming back to this first history, over slavery, 1798, you have Adventism, raised up as a denominated people. It happens in the history of the Second Great Awakening. And it particularly happens in the early 1800s, in this history when slavery is beginning to be debated widely through Protestantism. It was a major subject of the Second Great Awakening. We will discuss one of their leading ministers, Charles Finney, who is involved in that. So there is not So there is a lot of issues that happened between 1798 and 1850. It is complex. It is more than slavery. It is also the issues of immigration, of American expansionism, other subjects that relate to how America was supposed to look as a lamb-like beast. Just reviewing something that we spoke about, the election of 1844, as we continue to expand on the Alpha history of modern Israel, we are going to cover that history in more detail. We need to start thinking about external and internal events, scatterings and gatherings through the 1798 to the 1863 history. But we looked at the 1844 election, particularly the external events of 1844, and we saw that it was an election fought between Clay and Polk. Famous Kentucky Senator Henry Clay declared that the church divisions happening in 1844 were the greatest source of danger to our country. What happened in the United States was a religious civil war before there was ever a civil war between states. And that religious civil war was fought from 1844 and 1845. I want us to think about one side topic. When we think about this election, what happened with Protestantism? What we did last week is we spoke about the three main Protestant religions. There were the Baptists, the Methodists, and the Presbyterians. These were the three largest Protestant denominations in the United States. And we spoke about how they began to split over slavery. It began decades before. In fact, the Methodists back in the early 1790s, they had said that they would excommunicate every slave owning member of their church. They had to pull back from the threat about 6 months later because it appeared it was going to split their church. So they had never actually enacted that. But the issues over slavery, that position, these churches were taking over the subject of slavery was splitting them from exceedingly early on. Quoting, long before cannons fired over Fort Sumter, civil war raged within America's churches. 3 of the nation's largest Protestant denominations were torn apart over slavery or related issues. The Methodist Church split in 1844. The Baptist split from the history of 1840 to 1845. And the Presbyterian Church began to split in 1843 and finished that split in 1844. So centering around the history of 1844, these 3 largest churches, Protestant churches of America, are torn apart. It sets the stage for the Civil War. Some people claim, including those of the time, there would never have been a civil war if the churches had stayed united on these things. It had a direct cause and effect relationship. What I want us to think about is how Ellen White handles 1844. Because we went to the quote in 10 MR 69, 1 and 2, paragraph 1 and 2. She's going to speak about what happened in Protestantism. The Great Controversy, 389.2, she says, the second angel's message of Revelation 14 was first preached in the summer of 1844, and it had a more direct application to the churches of the United States, where the warning of the judgment had been most widely proclaimed and most generally rejected, and where the declination, I think that's how you say that word, in the churches had been most rapid. But the message of the second angel did not reach its complete fulfillment in 1844. The churches then, in 1844, experienced a moral fall in consequence of their refusal of the light of the Advent message. But that fall was not complete. But she is going back and looks at 1844, and she is writing this in the history of the Great Controversy. So she is taking the long view. If Christ had come back in 1863, there would be no statement that the fall was not complete. You can see how it progressed to the 1888 Fundy Law history. But she says that they fell in 1844, and that is when there was a declension in the churches, a moral fall. What is she speaking about that happened in Protestantism in 1844? What is she speaking about? What it literally looks like was the massive schism through Protestantism. Schism. If you think about the Russian Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church and how significant it is to have a schism through a church in that year in the history of 1843 to 1845, what is happening through Protestant America is massive. The Protestant churches back there cover almost the entirety of the population. Everyone is a Protestant, and yet this massive split, she never mentions. All she does is refer to it as a declension.
So let's bring in the Sabbath.
Okay,
Let's bring in the Sabbath.
someone like, right?
Almighty God, as the sun is set upon many of us, and some of us have already entered our Sabbath, we just thank you for bringing us through another week. And we ask you for your continued blessings upon us, upon our study, and that we might receive a double portion of your Spirit through the messages that we study throughout the Sabbath day, that we could grow in wisdom and understanding, in seeing more clearly all of the various lines, see them clearly in our minds, and in the events that are taking place, that we would be equipped as the teachers that you have called us to be. So we thank you and praise you. And as we bring in the Sabbath, Lord, we thank you for it. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. So just to finish up, I think there's just a few pages more. The Protestant churches back there cover almost the entirety of the population. Just reviewing this paragraph. Everyone is a Protestant, and yet this massive split she never mentions. So all she does is refer to it as a declension. It almost sounds in her words like a moral fall because there are these consequences. They rejected light. She does not link this spiritual experience to what is happening with external events. I want us to begin thinking why she does that. And that is why I gave the quote for 10 MR 69, paragraph 1 and 2. We have about 4 pages. I think we know this quote. I referenced it a number of times when woman visits her, woman visits her and speaks about the increase of crime and a particular law that was being introduced in Europe and was threatening to come to America. That caused a great deal of crime, demoralization, and suffering in society. This sister tells Ellen White that the only way for this law to be understood is that woman must vote. Ellen White tells her, my mind was unprepared for any such matter as a woman voting. You look at Ellen White's quotes through her writings about the role of women in politics, and she is noticeably clear. Her mind was not prepared. She could not handle the thought of a woman voting. But not just voting, having opinions, voicing opinions on political matters. It's easy for us to see that view in how she speaks about home life, about how she speaks what the focus of other women should be, that they shouldn't have been trying to gain the right to vote. They should be focusing on their families, on their children. What we don't conceptualize is how that actually impacts her own work and her own writings. Because when Ellen White comes to an external event, what does she never seem to do, or very rarely do? She very rarely gives us the political events surrounding that mark. If you want to know about James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, if you want to know about the 1888 Sunday laws, beyond this spiritual explanation of morality and rights and wrongs, you can't go to Ellen White. You need to go to A.T. Jones. You need to go to James White or Uriah Smith or any of the other pioneers. But she can never give you the political external events of her time. So when you come to 1844, it is not just the political events of the United States. She does not give us. That she does not give us. But this split within the churches is the political aspect of those Protestant churches. It is what they are debating in closed meetings. It is what they are coming to physical fights over at the front of their Protestant churches. At the front of their meeting places, it is a political argument. So even though she will later speak about slavery and the sin of slavery, she does not speak about the political events of her time. If you look up Abraham Lincoln in her writings, you will find that Lincoln is mentioned 10 times. 8 of those 10 times, she is talking about Lincoln, Nebraska, a place. She is not relating anything to the president. Twice she is speaking about Abraham Lincoln. In those passages, she is making a very brief spiritual application to the fact that he is a good administrator. She is not explaining him as a politician. Because of her own time and her own mindset, she gives us a warped view of their history. And that has been a legacy issue Adventism has had ever since. So when Adventism comes and looks at 1844, we think it must have rained every Sunday. They must have been real depressed on Sunday. That there's just this moral fall. Maybe their numbers went down. Maybe people got busy and didn't go to church as much. She cannot give us the external events the same way every other male pioneer did. So if you want to know about Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, where did we have to go? A.T. Jones. If you want to know about Abraham Lincoln, where do you have to go? James White. And these are the external events that create the external line of the entire reform line. She had to be a woman for a certain reason. But it also, we need to conceptualize how that impacted her writings. Because in her humanity as an individual could not break out of the chains that bound her at that time. When she says woman should not be getting involved in politics, she is also speaking about herself. And it impacts her writings and it impacts how we see these wedding rings. If she had been a male prophet in that time period, there would have been other consequences. But we would have had more of an explanation of these external events. We would not have come to 1844 and just had it described as a moral fall. And then those political church decisions go by unmentioned. No other pioneer has handled history in that same way. But we know in God's wisdom, she was chosen because she was what Adventism needed. We need to be aware of the consequences of that decision, though. So we've spoken a lot about Protestants in the history of the Millerites as being essentially the bad guys. The Protestants were the ones in the South defending slavery from their understanding of the Bible. But what we do, not properly do, is also recognize that they were the good guys on the other side. It was this split within Protestantism. And this split was not always neat. John Quincy Adams in 1844 went before Congress and said that they needed to amend the Constitution and announce the United States was a Christian nation. And yet, if you look at other lines of history, he is a good guy. So I'm not saying the split is so clear-cut and simple, but there is this split between socially liberal and socially conservative that began down in the First Great Awakening, extending through 1798 into the Second. And it has continued to today. Part of this was developed into the split over slavery. And again, it's because this conservative fraction believes in this literal to literal interpretation. America is a Christian nation, church, and state. Ancient Israel had slaves. Modern Israel must have slaves. I'm going to read that again. America is a Christian nation, church, and state. Ancient Israel had slaves, and modern Israel must have slaves. I find it interesting, one of these individuals, a Presbyterian minister who was a leader in the Second Great Awakening, Charles Grandison Finney, August 29th, 1792. He was born August 16th. 1875. He was an American Presbyterian minister and leader in the Second Great Awakening. He was called the father of modern revivalism. Trouble with that one. Revivalism? Yeah. He was best known as being a flamboyant revivalist preacher during particularly the decade from 1825 to 1835 in upstate New York and Manhattan. He was an opponent of the old school Presbyterian theology, the old school conservative, socially conservative branch. Together with several other evangelical leaders, his religious views led him to promote social reforms such as anti-slavery and equal education for women and African Americans. From 1835, he taught at Oberlin College of Ohio, which accepted students without regard to race or sex. He served as its second president from 1855 to 1865, during which its faculty and students were activists for abolition and the Underground Railroad and universal education, which we read about, Finney, that history. So you find Protestants on both the right side and the wrong side of these issues. That becomes significant when we start thinking about today and how to view our role in Protestantism. So this is the end of part 1. And I think she had a prayer with this, I thought. Anyway, maybe not.
I thought it was interesting. Something,
Yeah, I
something
thought she
that-
had a prayer for this, but I
something
don't
that
see it. Go ahead.
something that I didn't catch before, but you know, when you look at the Vespers classes and the direction they're going, help me if anybody else caught this too, that there was a civil or religious civil war before there was the Civil War.
Yes,
So religion was the issue.
all along.
All, yeah, but then the Civil War was slavery, and that went on in the religions, just like we have freedom and equality that goes on in the religions in the Republican and the Democrat Party today. So
Right.
anybody else catch some of that or think they're thinking the same lines as?
Yeah, those two elements. Somebody else has something to contribute. Yeah. I thought about it, of course, as I was reading it, you know, and studying this.
So what would that look like here?
Well, I'm just looking at what she did last week and how she's calling this a post-church era. Is that the word she used, era?
It's
Yeah.
post-Christian. It's
Post-Christian.
post-Christian.
Thank you, post-Christian. I don't know what I said, but post-Christian, thank you. And how it wasn't how it isn't, if I'm understanding correctly, it isn't about church and state. It's the whole package of equality and freedom versus equality.
Yeah, we're just seeing the history of church and state, though, with the United States,
So
because it went back clear to 16, whatever it was, 17.
19.
Yeah. And yet, you know, you would never know that today. It's not taught. That history has never been taught, you know, to our nation. In the education system, you know, I never
know
knew
it. I
this.
remember it's been quite a few years when I saw this in the Great Controversy, but it's in the chapters before the Millerite history. in that history that you're just talking about, 1619 in there, when,
16.
how in that history and how they left Europe to escape that union of church and state. But I can't remember which chapter it is. It's early on. Somebody maybe can look at the name of the chapter, but it's like you could see them continuously trying to go back to uniting church and state. The Pilgrims came and people saw that what they were doing was having success, and they wanted to come be where they were at. And then the Pilgrims started to say, if I'm remembering, it's been a long time since I read that section, but then the Pilgrims are saying, well, I think it was in Plymouth, where they were setting up, and then they started to make laws right off the bat that, well, you can join us, but you have to be our religion. So it kind of traces through that history until you then get to what you just went through with 1798 and James Madison and Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, because it seemed like 1776 was when, the nation really, USA, began to start going in the better way. They call that the period of, freedom and Republican. And, it was in that time frame that really it was church and state from the beginning.
And if they'd seen the external events, it's interesting. I want to go back and reread that manuscript release that I wrote it down. Go back and read that about her and women voting and not talking about politics.
Yeah,
I want to
exactly.
go back and read that. So it's just interesting when you think about their failure, that's a history of failure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know what I'm trying to say. Maybe somebody caught what I was trying to verbalize, but it seemed like you can see that. The one part that was said it kind of plainly, but then you can kind of see it going on with all the stuff she was talking about. But that there was a religious civil war before there was a civil war, and the civil war was over slavery. But it involved the two, it involved the ethos, if that's the right word to use in that history as well.
Yeah.
So anyways, just thinking out loud, I guess.
All right, thank you. That quote, you're talking about 10 MR?
Yeah, it was page 26, I think, at the bottom of page 26.
Yeah, I was just scanning back here.
10 MR 69, paragraphs 1 and 2.
Yeah. That is talking about Ellen White and her view, why she could not connect politics, that that was not of her mindset in that time. It's external. So it's true. If we want that history, we have to go to James White for what do we say? And his view of Abraham Lincoln, was it? Wait a minute here. Yeah, because she wasn't writing anything about Lincoln at this point. Nothing. She didn't say much about the slavery issue either, but yet it was a heinous crime, really. It's not. Slavery was hated by God. It's just the opposite of equality. So, are there any other thoughts? Somebody else have something to say about the study? Vespers.
Yeah, we could probably, if everybody's okay, close in prayer. I don't know about you guys, but I'm kind of anxious to go turn that Vespers class on.
probably on WhatsApp. Yeah, I'm sure it is. That's how he sends it
Yeah.
to. So, well, I appreciate everyone's listening and being attentive and yes, supporting me as I go along, getting my hand going in the right direction with my right hand. My worst hand is my right one. It's still recovering, but I was able to keep up and move along here, and I'm very thankful I could do this and share it. And we'll have the shorter ending to this tomorrow. It's only 20 pages.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Yes.
Can we have somebody close in prayer? Jackie, would you like to?
Yes, I will close. Thank you. Yeah, I can get rid of this afterwards. Dear God in heaven, we thank you so much for this truth, for the light you give us, for the lines, for the history, for the application, for the parables, all the ways in which that we see what you were like. It's your character. And we just thank you that you have given this to your elders, Elder Tess, who did this study, and that we had a lot like Adventism to correct so many wrong views that we had of the truth and what you were like and what you want to accomplish through us in this time in which we live. It takes time to correct all these wrong mistakes and the mistakes that come through the wrong mindset. And I pray that each one of us will apply what you have given us with the mind of Christ, with your mind, God, that we can see things rightly. And it's not an Apis Bowl experience, but it's real. It's from the heart. It's our humanity that you've changed. And this is what moves us forward. It becomes part of us, this truth, that we may give it to others, and what you desire and waited for so long with now this dispensation that we are in with equality, understanding more about sexism and what this entails. It goes so deep. And yes, I'm sure in Sister White's time it was coming out of the slavery problem and so many things. And yet we can review this and see where we went off the pathway. And that's why it's so important to know what the history is, because we could tell our own history and the history of the past and what has happened with Adventism as well as with the USA and the shipwrecks. And that's where we are. And we know that time is short. So may we apply ourselves diligently to study up the word and sharing it with each other and supporting each other in every way we can. I thank you for this privilege to be able to share this with the group tonight. And we just thank you for every blessing you give us, especially the Sabbath, and that we will be much blessed on in the Sabbath hours. I thank you for all that you do for us. May we keep our hearts and minds on you. In Jesus' name we pray and thank thee. Amen.